something to say. I killed your baby today, and it doesn't matter much to me as long as it's dead. Well, I got something to say. Well, I raped your mother today, and it doesn't matter much to me as long as she's spread.
If there was one defining trait that distinguishes your average low-stakes player from your average high-stakes player, it would be, in a word, greed. Low-stakes players are often reluctant to put all of their chips in the middle without the near nuts, but for most high-stakes regs, playing for stacks is like drinking water. They understand that very strong hands are hard to come by, so when they're fortunate enough to land one, there's a shift in mindset where every subsequent decision is designed to inflict maximum pain. So how can a novice adopt this hyper-aggressive mentality? Well, as it turns out, the solver is also a greedy bastard, so we can analyze its play to help us gain insights into the most efficient way to play for massive pots. And we're going to use DriveHUD's powerful R&D feature to assist with our analysis. This module allows a user to break down a player's game by an almost infinite number of different metrics. For our purposes, since we want to know how the solver accelerates growing the pot, we're going to take a look at the bot's bet sizings on each street. So we've created 3 separate R&Ds which show the bet sizings used by Pluribus on the flop, turn, and river. This includes c-bets, probes, and delayed c-bets. As we can see, on all 3 streets, Pluribus made a number of bets that are in excess of the size of the pot, also known as an overbet. In contrast, under Ariel's basic game plan, the largest bet she was allowed to make was 100% of the pot. The purpose of this limitation was to reduce variance for a beginner. But with over 6,000 hands under her belt and mixed results, it's now time to take off the leash. When we review her overall graph, although the sample size is small, there appears to be a pattern that's emerging. Her win rate has been hovering around break-even, but her showdown winnings are high and her non-showdown winnings are low. This isn't necessarily problematic in and of itself, but it could be a signal that her bet sizing is not ideal. Specifically, it could be the case that she's betting too small with her stronger hands, which results in excessive calling by her opponents. Now, some of you may be wondering why it's such a bad thing for your opponents to call when you have a strong hand. Well, in a vacuum, it's not. We want our opponents to call our value bets with worse. But that logic only goes so far. In theory, we could min bet with the nuts and get called by most of our opponent's range, but that would be a waste of a bet. The best players in the world and the solver are very greedy because in order to maximize our EV, we need to maximize the size of the pot with our strongest hands. And sometimes this will mean that our bet will be so large that it causes our opponent to fold hands he would otherwise call with versus a smaller bet, but that's okay. We needn't be too worried about scaring away our opponents with large bets, so long as we pair our strong hands with bluffs. By balancing our range in this way, it forces our opponents to call with inferior hands, or else lose massive EV versus our bluffs. So when exactly should we use these overbets? Well, bet sizing is one of the most complicated aspects of poker strategy, but there are a few common factors that tend to impact when overbets are used. One is the betting street we're on. When we go back to Pluribus's data, one thing that stands out is that although the bot overbets on all 3 streets, the street it overbet least often on is the flop, even though the flop is by far the most commonly encountered betting round. And this is not simply a coincidence. When you bet on the flop, there are obviously still 2 additional betting rounds to come, and when you bet on the turn, there's still 1 additional betting round to come. But on the river, it's your last chance to get chips in the middle. In other words, all other things being equal, the greater number of future opportunities you have to bet, the less urgent it is to accelerate growing the pot now. Along the same lines, another factor that impacts overbetting frequency is the SPR. If we filter all of Pluribus's bets to only include single raise pots, we see that this is where the vast majority of overbets are made. Similar to our last factor, this has to do with urgency. When the SPR is high, if our goal is to play for stacks, the most efficient way to do so is by placing large bets over multiple streets. On the other hand, when the SPR is low, such as is the case in a 3-bet or 4-bet pot, it becomes much easier to play for all the chips by the river without betting huge on multiple streets. Of course, this doesn't mean that you will never overbet in 3-bet or 4-bet pots. For example, when the SPR becomes very low, going all in can oftentimes yield the greatest EV, and usually the threshold strength of a hand for felting is decreased when we get shallow. But for the most part, overbets are more common when the SPR is high. The final and probably most important factor for overbetting is nut advantage, or in other words, having a proportionally greater percentage of the strongest hands in your range. To highlight this dynamic, let's take a look at a few of Pluribus's hands where it overbet. In this hand, Pluribus opened the hijack with ace-7 of hearts and the button called. Pluribus bet half pot on the flop, the button called, and then Pluribus bombed the turn 2x the pot, and the button folded. According to GTO Check, over 30% of Pluribus's range should be overbetting this size on the turn, and this is largely due to its nut advantage. When we zoom in on the highest equity hands, we see that Pluribus has a major advantage throughout, whether it be hands with 70% equity or more, 80% equity or more, or 90% equity or more. This is primarily because the button cold caller doesn't have many queens and he doesn't have any kings or aces. In this next hand, the button opened and Pluribus called in the small blind with queen jack of clubs. The flop went check check, and then Pluribus probed the turn 2x the pot, and the button folded. As was the case in the last hand, Pluribus has the proportional advantage at the top of the range, right around 80% equity plus. Note that the button actually has a greater absolute number of nuttish hands on this board, namely over pairs and sets, but because the small blind's cold calling range is so much tighter, a greater percentage of the small blind's range is made up of these nuttish hands, which is the key. And in this last hand, Pluribus opened in the hijack with ace of clubs, king of hearts, the big blind called. Pluribus c-bet 50%, and the big blind called again. The turn was the 4 of hearts, and Pluribus overbet 2x the pot. And once again, we see Pluribus with a significant advantage at around 70% equity and above. So anecdotally at least, it seems pretty clear that nut advantage is an important driver to overbetting. But why is it important? Well, there are a number of reasons. When we have a nut advantage, it means relatively speaking, we have a greater proportion of the class of hands that is most incentivized to play for stacks. Additionally, when our opponent has a lower proportion of nuttish hands, it weakens his range, which in turn increases the equity of the combos in our range. And since there's a correlation between a hand's equity and the size of the pot it's willing to play for, when our opponent has fewer nutted hands, it typically increases the aggression of our nutted range. Furthermore, the EV of overbetting with our strongest hands is primarily derived from getting weaker hands to call, and villain's range typically has a greater percentage of weaker hands when it has fewer nuttish combos. And last but not least, our bluffs have improved fold equity when our opponent has fewer stronger hands to defend with. So given these three factors, we're going to devise a simplified overbetting heuristic that even a beginner like Ariel can follow. First off, she's only going to overbet on turns and rivers in single raise pots since, as we discussed, these are the situations where there is the greatest urgency to accelerate growing the pot. Second, she must have many strong hands in her range, because when we choose any bet sizing, we want to ensure that we have a sufficient number of hands that can make that same bet for purposes of disguising our range. And third, villain's range must be substantially capped, meaning that he has a lower likelihood of holding a very strong hand, which, when coupled with the second prong, gives us the nut advantage. When all three of these conditions are met, on the turn, Ariel is going to bet 150 to 200% of the pot with her strongest hands and strongest draws, and after overbetting the turn on safe rivers, she's going to overbet 150% up to all in with her strongest and weakest hands. To explain how this heuristic works, let's take a look at a few examples. In this hand, Ariel opened the low jack with king jack off and the big blind called. The flop came king queen 4 and Ariel bet her top pair half pot. The turn was the 5 of clubs, Ariel barreled with another half pot bet, and villain folded. However, when we take a look at the solver solution, we see that over 40% of its range uses this much larger 150% pot bet. So first off, we are on the turn in a single raise pot. Additionally, we have plenty of strong hands in our range. We have pocket kings, pocket queens, king queen, both suited and offsuit, aces, and ace king and king jack, both suited and offsuit. Additionally, villain's range is relatively capped as a function of three things. First, it was the pre-flop caller. Second, since we bet relatively small on the flop, villain should have done a significant amount of raising with its strong hands given the low SPR. If we go back to the big blind's decision on the flop, we see that almost all sets, most two pairs, and the strongest top pairs raise because these hands have a strong incentive to grow the pot. So when the big blind decided not to raise, it means that we can remove many of these stronger hands from its range. And third, the turn card is a relative blank, meaning that it doesn't significantly improve villain's range, such as by pairing an ace or completing straights or flushes. He has king 5, queen 5, and 4-5, but overall his range mostly misses this card. As a result, his range, which was largely capped by virtue of not raising pre-flop or on the flop, fails to become uncapped by this turn card. The combined effects of this sequence of events gives us a significant incentive to bet very large, and this is why this particular scenario is one of the paradigm situations to overbet the turn on, where we are in a single raise pot as the pre-flop aggressor, we c-bet a dry flop with a smaller sizing, the villain simply calls instead of raising, and the turn is a brick. We will overbet parts of our range almost 100% of the time when this situation arises. So now that we've established that this is a good spot to overbet in, the next question is, which hands do we allocate to this overbet bucket? Well, generally we want to overbet our nuttish hands that are capable of playing for stacks. Now, what constitutes a nuttish hand changes depending on the context. In a 100 big blind effective single raise pot, the weakest hand that can play for stacks is usually something like strong top pair with top kicker on a very dry board, and a strong two pair is often going to be good enough to stack off on many different boards. However, if the river brings in runner flush and straight draws, or we are very deep, obviously the threshold for the class of hand that can play for stacks will go up. Ultimately, analyzing a bunch of different sims on different types of runouts can help build our intuition of where the cutoff point lies for the nudge class, which will be heavily impacted by board texture, player ranges, and SPR. So in this hand, we're a bit over 100 big blinds deep, and it's a dry board, which means that the cutoff point for a nuttish hand will be right around top pair, top kicker plus. And to balance out our value range, we see that most unmade draws also use this sizing. Now, trying to mimic how the solver bets with its draws is essentially impossible because there are so many different variables which impact the strategy. But for our purposes, to simplify things, we're going to simply overbet with our best draws, meaning all of our combo draws, and our flush and straight draws that are drawing to the nuts or near nuts. Essentially, when we drive the pot towards getting all of the chips in the middle, we generally do not want to have hands that have a high possibility of being dominated. And then if we assume that villain called this bet and the river is another relative blank, let's say a 4 of spades, we see that basically all hands over pairs plus perform another overbet going all in. Note that in this particular case, since it was under the gun versus big blind, the ranges are somewhat narrow and stronger, which means that our threshold for stacking off will be higher. Additionally, we need to keep in mind that when we overbet and our opponent calls, it strengthens his range significantly as well. If we go back to the turn, we see that most of the big blind's range is folding, including some top pairs. Accordingly, although our strongest top pair, ace-king, does triple barrel, it doesn't use the overbet, since our value bets need to be called by a significant portion of villain's weaker range, and the big blind doesn't have a ton of hands that are weaker than top pair that would be willing to call another overbet. Now let's take a look at another slightly different scenario. In this hand, Ariel opened the hijack with ace-queen of hearts and the cutoff cold called. The flop came queen 6 deuce, a relatively dry board, and Ariel continued with a quarter pot bet and villain called. The turn was a deuce of clubs and Ariel bet again, this time half pot. However, the solver also likes the overbet with this hand and with 16% of the entire range, including basically all overpairs and trips. Again, we're in a single raise pot on the turn, and we definitely have a number of strong hands here, including queens, sixes, ace deuce suited, overpairs, and ace queen and king queen suited and offsuit. Also, we bet small on the flop, which villain simply called, and the turn doesn't really change much. Accordingly, we have a major nut advantage. Note, however, that since we're out of position and queens heavily block villain's continuing range, the solver starts slow playing with the nuts and second nuts. But to keep things simple, we're not going to slow play in this overbetting line. Remember, the word for the day is greed. And since we bet small on the flop, and we only have 2 betting streets that remain, we really want to jumpstart the growth of the pot for our strongest hands with the aim of getting stacks in by the river. On the bluffing side, our overbets could be structured to include something like 5-4 of diamonds and all ace and king high flush draws. And let's say that we did overbet here, villain called, and the river was something like the 4 of spades. In that case, we see that over 40% of our range shoves over 2x the pot, including most overpairs plus. And we also see that a small sliver of top pair top kicker shoves as well. Finally, let's take a look at one last example where this time we're not the pre-flop aggressor. In this hand, villain opened the cutoff and Ariel called in the big blind with queen 7 of diamonds. The flop was ace 4 deuce and it went check check. The turn was a 9 of diamonds and Ariel bet half pot and villain folded. However, the solver actually heavily favors the 150% pot overbet with this combo and with 13% of its range. So why is this? Well, let's walk through our heuristic. We are in a single raise pot and we're on the turn. We have a decent number of strong hands in our range, including 3-5 suited for the straight, pocket deuces, pocket 4s, pocket 9s, ace 9, ace 4, ace deuce, and 4-2. All hands that have a strong incentive to play a large pot. On the other hand, villain had the opportunity to c-bet on the flop and probably should have bet with most of his strong hands in position but chose not to, so the likelihood of him having a very strong hand is decreased. And the 9 of diamonds turn is a relative blank. Yes, it's possible the cutoff has pocket 9s or ace 9, but overall this card doesn't improve most of his range. So given the action, we see that the big blind has a slight nut advantage with hands that have 80% equity or more. The cutoff still does have some strong hands in his range, particularly a bunch of top pairs with weak kickers that didn't need much protection on the flop, which is why the big blind does a lot of checking. But given that we have an ample number of nutted hands, we're going to have some betting here, and when we do bet, it will be large. We see that most straights, sets, and 2 pairs use the overbet. The solver does a lot of slow playing as well, for the reasons we've mentioned in prior videos, but for simplicity's sake, Ariel is just going to bet these hands in full. And to balance this range, we're going to structure our bluffs to look something like all of our combo draws, and our strongest flush draws, such as queen high flushes or better, and our straight draws to the nuts. Again, we're not going to define hard and fast rules regarding which draws should be bet, but generally the number of bluffs we fire should proportionally mirror how many value combos we have, and in this case, since so many draws are available, we need to be somewhat judicious in terms of how many we use to overbet with. And if we had bet 150% on the turn and villain called and the river was a brick, something like 8 of spades, we see that sets and straights mostly shove over 4x the pot, and 2 pair mostly uses the 2x sizing. So in this video we devised a simple heuristic for overbetting, which is an essential tool to maximize EV. Now beginners may face some trepidation in making these types of bold moves, as they will undoubtedly increase variance, and you'll end up losing your stack on more than one occasion. To overcome this psychological hurdle, it's important to disregard the money and potential embarrassment of making a big mistake. Instead, channel the cold callousness of a psychopath and learn to find a twisted pleasure in devouring your opponent's chips. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.